How optimistic are you that the peace deal will work? Obviously, we're still in phase one, which is an incredibly important phase, which is the release of the hostages, something some of us have been crying for 2 years. Phase two is going to be more difficult, but is equally important, which is the decommissioning of Hamas, the complete surrender and disarming of this army of anti-Semites, which I think is absolutely essential to the security of Israel and to the security of the Western world. But that's going to be very difficult. How optimistic are you that this will work out in Israel's favor and by extension in the favor of the civilized world?
Well, isn't it interesting, Brendan, that you refer to it and others as a peace deal? I've not heard that from the Arab world, and I've certainly not heard that from Hamas. This is being referred to as a ceasefire, and in fact, if you look at the footage that has come out of the Gaza Strip of those celebrating the ceasefire agreement when it was finally concluded, when it was finally agreed, it has been promising Kaiba al Yahud, going after Jews in the future as the sort of biblical precedent in Kaiba of Muhammad slaughtering Jews. It has been promising a renewed attempt to wipe Israel off of the map. That's not peace. And so ultimately, as you've described, phase two involving critically the decommissioning of Hamas, and this is the other aspect of Israel's war aims. They were always the return of the hostages, defeating Hamas, and ensuring there's a new reality in Gaza. Not just so that Gazan terrorists were unable to commit the 7th of October over again and threaten Israelis in a similar fashion, but also a new reality in Gaza for the people of Gaza. And what we have seen, unfortunately, even in the first couple of days of this ceasefire, is Hamas reasserting their violent control over the civilian population. And in this instance, with, unfortunately, the blessing of the President of the United States. Now, he's a deal maker, right? And all of this is about getting the best deal that you can at any given time. And the fact that we are promised the release of every single hostage, we've had the live hostages released, every single hostage that has been murdered by Hamas, that the bodies will be returned so that they can be buried by their families. That is a very, very important step forward, but it's not a step towards peace. It's a step towards righting the wrongs, certainly, to a certain extent, and taking this immense weight off of the government and the people of Israel that it needed its people returned. But the big questions, and frankly, they're not answered by the 20-point plan that Trump has put forward. That's not to say that this is not a remarkable achievement. It is, by virtue of what we have seen today. But phase two, reading it strikes me as very far away, because you don't have that full commitment, or I would say a realistic commitment of Hamas to disarm. And because you have this fudge, which is, I think, very important just to highlight as we're concluding, this fudge that the Palestinian Authority in a reimagined form, or a less corrupt, reconstituted form, will be responsible for governing the Gaza Strip. Now, fine, if that's what's required for the facilitation of this deal and the important historic occasion we've had today, so be it. This is the art of the deal, I suppose. But it is not realistic until one actually grapples with the drivers of this conflict: indoctrination to terror, incentivization to terror, which is, of course, continually meted out by the so-called moderates that this deal is talking about having run the Gaza Strip. These are terrorist supporters, terrorist advocates who pay the salaries. Still, there's been this, again, complete misinformation that the pay-for-slay policy has been ended. That is untrue. And Palestinian Media Watch is continuing to put out important information that talks about the continuation of what are essentially terror salaries under a new welfare program. But they're doing the same thing. And until that is fixed, I say this regretfully, peace is not on the table. All these leaders and, unfortunately, many of the civilians, if you will, the uninvolved civilians in this case, have been calling for a renewal of this genocidal war against the Jews, because that is all they have been taught from kindergarten. And that is going to take time. That is going to take a generation to fix. And the longer that we allow Palestinian children to be indoctrinated from kindergarten, the further that kind of generational change is going to take us. So that's what we need to be focusing on. One step at a time is something that I'm fully willing to buy into, but we need to approach what has been presented, what has been agreed with a degree of realism. One caveat to that, I would say, is that outside of the Palestinian issue, of this indoctrination, of this incentivization to terror, we do have more and more countries looking like they're going to be signing up to the Abraham Accords. And what the messaging around this momentous occasion today allows Trump to do is to extend that deal of the Abraham Accords, which is actually true peace, which is a remarkable achievement. And the reason that they're peace agreements is because, even unlike the peace agreement with Egypt and the peace agreement with Jordan, which have been relatively cold pieces since they came into force, the Abraham Accords peace agreements have been incredibly warm agreements and relationships that have flourished, and they have survived this tumultuous period of these 2 years, despite many people thinking that simply wasn't possible. So I would certainly encourage, optimism in terms of peace in the wider region. And so much of the reshaping of the Middle East, with the strikes on Iran, with defeating Hezbollah in Lebanon, with eviscerating so much of the leadership of the Houthis in Yemen, of essentially taking away Iran's terror proxies. So much of that initiative in reshaping the region, I think, is going to facilitate peace with a capital P more broadly. For us to be able to achieve that in the context of the Palestinians in Israel, we are going to need to do some serious work in the West with our own understanding of how that region operates, of the people that we are dealing with, and of the real needs of the Palestinian civilians here. And the more that we see, calls for a recognition of a state which is ultimately going to be run by Hamas or their ilk, the harder that is going to be, that shift in analysis to be able to replicate what we're seeing more broadly in the region in that very, very small parcel of land itself. And I've yet to take my pin off because, as you say, we are still awaiting the return of the bodies of those who were murdered by Hamas, either over the last 2 years, but of course there are some hostages who have been held for many years prior to that. It is certainly a mix of feelings, and so many of the Israeli officials have spoken to exactly this, holding at the same time those feelings of celebration and joy, coupled with that tragedy, not just of everything that Israel has experienced over the last 2 years, but of course everything that the region has experienced. And there's a great deal of suffering that has ultimately led to this point. I think it is important to step back and to take stock of what has ultimately brought us here and the trials and tribulations along the way, and to learn lessons. Because unfortunately, what many have foretold and warned of is that the sort of release deal that Israel has engaged in with Hamas, which includes the release of hundreds of security prisoners, convicted murderers, people with blood on their hands, terrorists, that will simply encourage further hostage taking in the future. And that's a very important additional part of the matrix that I think everyone who has been following this developing story closely understands and has to hold together with the joy that I think any reasonable decent person would feel upon the return of those who have been kept in Hamas captivity in tunnels for 2 years, and seeing those reunions with their families today is a very special moment indeed.
Yeah, Israel has certainly paid a high price for the return of the 20 living hostages. And when I see people refer to it as a hostage exchange, it
It's,
drives me mad because
it's disgusting. Yeah.
what Israel is doing is quite extraordinary, isn't it? Do you think it's a risk? I mean, it's obviously a calculated risk, but what do you think the consequences might be of releasing some of those kinds of people?
Oh, we have precedent on this. We have the likes of Yahya Sinwar, who was, of course, released in the exchange for previous hostage Gilad Shalit. who then went on, of course, to meticulously plan and lead the 7th of October atrocities and the war that followed. So that is a very real concern, especially because of the nature of some of these terrorists who have been released. I heard a couple of days ago from a British Israeli woman, Tal Wilson, who is a survivor of a terrorist attack in which her friend was murdered, and she only survived really because of her sheer grit and determination. She was stabbed multiple times and was very close to death. She informed me a few days ago that she had just been told that her would-be murderer and her friend's killer would be released as part of this exchange, and yet she was celebrating the return of these hostages. And I think that is a very important factor to understand, and it's not one that we really see discussed in the media at all, this dichotomy, and this, real dilemma ultimately that Israel has been in the middle of. But of course, with the return of these hostages, Hamas has now lost that leverage, and that is critical. And I think the reasons that we've gotten to this point ultimately are also multifaceted. The American delegation that have been in Israel for the last couple of days have repeatedly congratulated Prime Minister Netanyahu on his leadership, his very tough decision-making. They have congratulated and thanked the Israeli Defense Forces, the bravery and the commitment of Israel's soldiers that ultimately led to the point where this deal was possible. And of course, President Trump is being repeatedly congratulated because ultimately it was the president that brought the Arab world on board with this deal. And it was through pressure from, for example, Qatar and Turkey, that Hamas has now finally been convinced, along with the military pressure put on it by the Israeli Defense Forces, that Hamas has now finally been left with no alternative but to give up all of the hostages, its only leverage, if you will, against the state of Israel, as it has been battling this terrorist organization.
It's 2025. America's debt is over $37 trillion, and the dollar just had its worst crash since 1973. That puts your savings and your family's future at risk. That's why we trust Alpha Omega Gold, a company that stands unapologetically with Israel and supports Stand Tall Israel. Visit ao.gold/stand to claim your free precious metals wayfinder guide or call 1-855-426-4653 today. Protect your future before it's too late.